AWS Security Groups. They're everywhere, and they form the basis of network connectivity or the lack of connectivity. If you want to be able to connect across the network to your resources, or you want to be able to connect an EC2 instance to, say, a load balancer, you're going to need to understand security groups and how to set them up and configure them. Stay tuned for my next video in the Back to Basics series, Mastering AWS Security Groups. Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about AWS security groups and how to get started with them. Now, security groups are one of those fundamental networking components that you need to understand in order to do pretty much anything and get it working within AWS. But it's also a concept that tends to get people tripped up, especially when they're new. The aim of this video is to get you acquainted with security groups and how to get set up and running quickly. So let's dive in. In this video, we're going to cover a range of topics about AWS security groups and how they work and how you get them set up and working for you. We'll start with some of the basics and then move on to comparing security groups with another form of network security, network access control lists, or NACLs. All right, let's start with an overview of what security groups are. Centralized security groups are stateful firewalls that attach to a network interface inside of your AWS account. Now, that distinction of a network interface is important because you can have some services, say Lambda or RDS, for example, where the actual compute is sitting someplace else, maybe in another AWS account. And the connection into your AWS account is just a network interface. In these cases, your access to these resources is still going to be governed by security groups. Now, security groups are maintained at the hypervisor level, which provides you with some very real benefits here. First off, you aren't paying a performance hit for running this virtual firewall on your instance like you do with a OS level firewall. Secondly, any traffic that's actually blocked by the security group never arrives at your instance. So you can imagine if you have an attack that goes against a particular operating system running on an EC2 instance that maybe compromises your firewall. Well, if you block that traffic at the security group level, it never arrives at the instance, so you can never be subject to that attack. Now, each security group defines a set of rules for traffic that's going to be allowed to pass either to or from your instance. You can have multiple security groups attached to a single instance, up to 5 per network interface. Now, per network interface means that if, for example, you have 2 network interfaces attached to a single EC2 instance, you could, in theory, have 10 security groups that are applied. Just be careful when you start diving into this because it's really more of an advanced feature and it can get confusing. Now, the way I typically look at security groups is implement security groups based on functionality that you're exposing. So, for example, you might want to create a security group for web servers. And this is going to allow the traffic you would normally expect for a web server to be implemented. That way, if I've got multiple instances that are implementing web server functionality, I can share the security groups across those multiple instances. Makes it much easier to start managing things at scale. Another nice feature about security groups and the fact that they're implemented at the hypervisor level is the fact that you can change security groups on the fly while the instance is still running. There's no reboot required or anything like that. It's non-disruptive. So you can literally change as you're going and monitor what happens with the network traffic. It won't cause any disruption to your instance. Well, I suppose if you're actually removing a security group that's allowing traffic to your instance, it will disrupt that traffic, but your instance will be fine. It's not going to have any issues that have been caused. All right, so let's dive into how we can create security groups. There's actually multiple ways that you can create security groups. Some are better than others. Okay, so what we're going to do here is jump into the AWS console for our account, and we want to look up the VPC service. Now, I've opened that over here in this tab, and you can see along the left-hand side here, you've got an option for security groups. You've also got network ACLs or NACLs. We're going to talk about that a little bit later because it's somewhat related, but I'm going to focus here on security groups. Now, one of the things to be aware of is security groups are all governed or all attached to a specific VPC. So while you can share security groups across different instances that have been deployed to the same VPC, as soon as you start going to a different VPC, you're going to have different security groups, even if they have the same descriptive name, for example here, and same rules. So do have to be aware that every VPC is going to have its own set of security groups. The first security group we want to look at to understand is this thing here that's labeled default. Now, the default security group gets created when you create a new VPC. So every VPC gets its own default security group set up, ready to go. It's one of these things that helps you kind of get up and started pretty quickly. Now, we can see here as I select around the bottom panel here is changing. So let's look at the VPC for this specific. We're going to look at the default security group for this specific VPC here. You can see details. You can see the name, the owner. That's just the account ID. You can see a security group ID, and these are going to be unique. Little summary of the amount of rules that are set up there, description, etc. Now I'm going to switch over to the inbound rules tab, and you can see we're going to dive much more into the rules that are set up a little bit later. But you can see the default VPC starts with a single group. It's got an ID for the security group rule, and this allows all traffic, all protocols, all ports. So by default, AWS is giving you a security group rule that's going to allow absolutely every bit of traffic into this instance, whether it's UDP or TCP. Now, I can understand anybody who has a security background, they're probably alarm bells are going off here. Now, the one saving grace of this rule is you can see here source, and we're going to talk about this more when we start jumping into security group rules. But you can see here the source, so where it's going to allow the traffic from, is actually a security group ID, and it's the exact same thing as the security group. It's basically the ID for the security group that we're actually in. So what's happening is this security group has a rule that allows its own traffic to come back to itself. Now, I can understand this can be a little bit confusing, so let's talk about this in the form of a whiteboard. Okay, so let's start off here and imagine we've got an EC2 instance A and an EC2 instance B. And let's imagine that B has this default security group. Now, if A tries to communicate over to B, all of that traffic is going to be blocked because there isn't a security group that says from instance A, allow traffic through. Now, if we also implement this same security group here, that same default security group around instance A, now what happens is instance A and instance B can talk to each other Because the security group has a rule that says I'm going to allow all traffic on all ports from anything that implements this security group. What that does is it gives us a very easy way to start troubleshooting network connectivity. So if I've got an instance that's trying to access another instance and I can't make that work for some reason, I can go and I can attach the default security group to both of my EC2 instances and check. If it suddenly starts working, that means that the problem that we're experiencing is down to security groups and connectivity. If it doesn't start working, then we know that the problem is somewhere else and not in our security groups. So implementing the security group rule, let me get rid of that here. Implementing this security group, the default security group that allows all traffic, all protocols, all ports, and you would read this as from anything that implements that security group, so that default security group. Now, this can be useful, like I said, for troubleshooting. I would not recommend you use this as a regular security group to allow traffic. I wouldn't recommend you leave this in production, because what it does mean, once again, back at our whiteboard, is if something compromises instance A, now it's got unfettered access across the network to instance B. All ports, all traffic, nothing's going to block it. So I wouldn't use this for a regular, something I'm going to leave in production, but it is useful for, for debugging and testing. So. Okay, now that we've covered the default security group, I want to look at the next way that security groups get created. And this is a way that people end up with lots of security groups created in their accounts, and it kind of gets a little bit unmanageable. If I go into EC2 and I start creating a new instance, we'll go here, launch instance. Yes. We'll select Linux. It doesn't really matter. Instance type is fine. What happens if we now get here to this network security settings, and the default is going to be create a new security group. And we can start adding extra rules in here, like allow SSH, allow HTTPS. Where do I want it to be allowed from? What this is going to do is this is going to create a new security group every single time you launch that instance. So if you're not very cautious about doing this, every instance is going to get a new security group with a new set of rules. As you can imagine, this starts to get very unwieldy in your account. So let's I'm just going to click Launch Instance here. Oops. If we go back and we look at the security groups, you can see I've now got a new security group set up. It's called Launch Wizard 1. And if I'm not cautious and I don't start reusing security groups, I'm going to start getting lots and lots of Launch Wizard created security groups that are going to start building up my account. You can see here, now I've got a security group that allows SSH from anywhere on the internet. This is a very bad practice, by the way. Please do not allow SSH access from 000/0, because this is going to allow anybody on the internet to start trying to attack your instance and guess your password. Very, very bad practice. So please don't do this. How do I avoid this? Well, what I can start doing is, when I come back in here, again, I can go Linux, instance type, key pair. Instead of saying create a new security group, I can select an existing security group. And I can start selecting security groups that I have already pre-created. I'm going to jump into that next. Just be aware that If you do select create new security group, you're going to have a big mess to clean up after a little while. Selecting existing security groups really keeps that sprawl from happening. Okay, now I've shut down that instance I just launched, and I've actually gone in and deleted the security group that was created as part of that launch process. I really don't want an open SSH security group sitting around in my account because it's just a problem waiting to happen. So the next way, so we've covered default security group now. We've created those launch wizard created security groups. Now we're going to cover the way that you should really start thinking about and using security groups in your account. Now, if I'm in the VPC dashboard or if I'm in the EC2, both of them have options for security groups. And it will actually give you the same view, so that's fine. What I really want to do is I want to start creating security groups ahead of time because this is going to allow me to start reusing those. So what I can do is I can set up, again, let me back up here. I can go create security group. We'll give it a name. Now the name has to be all lowercase, no spaces. So video, just call it Video Web Server Security Group. Giving it a description is going to really help me to figure out what's and pick from lists. So next thing I need to do is pick the VPC. So as I mentioned before, security groups are specific to the VPC. So you can't share them across different VPCs. So I'm going to pick demo VPC. This is one that I have for some demo work that I've already done rather than the default VPC. So let's select that. And you can see I have two options here, or two sets of rules. One is inbound rules and one is outbound rules. So I'm going to come in here, and because this is a web server, I'm going to allow HTTP traffic. So I can pick the type of traffic that I want. The protocol is either going to be TCP or UDP. In this case, because I've specified HTTP, HTTP is a TCP protocol. We already know the port that it sits on is port 80. The other option is I could actually say custom TCP or custom UDP, and I could specify the port myself. I also have an option here for all traffic, which is something you really want to be cautious about using. So anyway, I'm going to pick HTTP. And now we have source. Source can be one of a couple of things. I can provide a CIDR block. Okay, and that would be any form of default CIDR block that's available. So in this case, for example, I could say I want to allow HTTP traffic from anywhere in the world. And there's a bunch of different options here for CIDR blocks. I can also pick existing security groups. So once again, you would read that as allow HTTP from anything that implements one of these security group rules. I've also got something called prefix lists, and I'm going to get to those in the more advanced section. So typically what happens is if you're going to stand up a public HTTP server, you might want to implement a rule similar to this that says allow HTTP from anywhere. Now, if you notice, if I click in here, I get security blocks, security groups. There's also an option that you can drop down here that helps you to pick certain items, like anywhere is an option. You can have an anywhere rule for IPv4, an anywhere rule for IPv6. There's also an option to say my IP. And what that's going to do is the console is going to figure out the IP address that you are connecting from and automatically populates that with a CIDR block. This is very useful if you need to be able to jump into that instance, for example. So in this case, I'm going to pick anywhere IPv4. And it's always a good idea to provide a description, especially if you're doing something that's not one of the default protocols. So this would be one of my security group rules. I want to add another one for my web server. And I would add HTTPS, again, from anywhere. Oops. These are my inbound rules. This is traffic coming into the instance. Now, I will say this, I wouldn't actually use this for a web server. And we'll talk about why I wouldn't do that a little bit later in the final section when I talk about connecting load balancers to your instances. But for our purposes at this stage, we'll say these are the rules I'm going to do. Notice I'm not adding a rule for either SSH or RDP into this web server. Okay, and I'm doing that for a very deliberate reason. It's a very bad idea to start adding security group rules that are going to allow that are going to allow either SSH or RDP from the internet. So avoid that at all costs. There are better ways to get into your instances than opening up RDP ports or SSH ports. Now, by default, our security groups get set up with an outbound rule that says it's going to allow all traffic out of the instance to anywhere. You may or may not like this as a rule. This is what gets set up by default. You can certainly restrict that outbound traffic. Just be aware that if you've done that, you're going to have more management for things like getting access to Windows updates and things of that nature. So by default, all traffic is going to be allowed out of the instance. Only HTTPS and HTTP are going to be allowed into the instance. Tags, because everything can have tags pretty much in AWS. I'm not going to bother adding any in there, but it's fine. We can now say create security group. Now, if I go back to my list of security groups here, you can see, once again, Video Web Server Security Group appears in my list, and it's attached to that VPC that I wanted it to be created in. And once again, I can review the rules here in the bottom section of this display. So I can see my inbound rules and my outbound rules. Now, if I go back to EC2 to launch an EC2 instance, once again, I can go test. Let's type keep here network settings. I can go select an existing security group and go here to need to select the VPC, subnet, and then I can say select existing security group, and I can see here my video web server security group. So once again, if I don't have the right VPC set up, I'm not going to see my security groups that are set up. Okay, so that's how you can pre-create security groups inside of your account and then use them as you launch instances rather than having instances create security groups as they go. Now, that's the third way. The fourth way that you could actually create security groups, and really the best way, is if you set up infrastructure as code. Now, the nature of this video being a back to basics, we're not going to cover infrastructure as code until a bit later in this series. So I'm not going to cover those right now, but creating your security groups through infrastructure as code means that you have a repeatable process. You've got some stuff checked into source control that you can then use, and you can then deploy across multiple accounts, multiple environments, etc. So just be aware, best way to create is through infrastructure as code. Good way of creating is by pre-creating your security groups up front. And in a not so good way, probably the worst way, is create security groups as you launch instances. Again, that's going to get very, very unmanageable once you start creating a lot of instances there. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into security group rules and how you should think about creating them to provide for the best level of security. Right, so back here on the whiteboard, let's imagine we're going to build a system for a website. So we've got a load balancer here. We're going to have an EC2 instance that is going to be our web server, and we're going to have an EC2 instance for our database server. Now, we're going to govern each of these with security groups. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a security group for the load balancer, a security group for our web server, and a security group for the database. And we're going to jump into the console and create those security groups. And what I want to do is I want to create the rules that are going to allow traffic to flow and still govern security in a way that is both flexible and powerful in the way that we do this. Okay, so now what I want to do is create 3 security groups, as I outlined in the whiteboarding session, to help govern the web server scenario that I wanted to create. And I'm going to create all the rules necessary to set that up in a very secure way. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start off create security group, and I'm going to create a load balancer. And I need to select the VPC that I want, remembering that security groups are created on a per VPC basis. So load balancer security group and VPC is demo VPC. And I'm going to hit create. Oops. Got to provide a description. Now you notice at this point in time, I'm not creating any rules. I just want to create the 3 security groups. Okay, so we got a load balancer. So web server, and one more, I'm going to create the database. Now you can see here, I get this list. I've got the database, the load balancer, and the web server security group. So now what I can do is start building out my rules for those security groups to start building referential security into my solution. So I'm going to start with the load balancer. That's the outwardmost security group. I'm not going to bother with outbound security rules. I'm just going to stick with the inbound rules. So I can do is say edit inbound, and I add a rule for HTTP and add a rule for HTTPS. Now, because this security group is designed to work on my load balancer, this is public facing. So I'm going to allow traffic from anywhere. So here I go. I got my load balancer, and it is all set up with the rules that I need to allow HTTP and HTTPS traffic to meet. If I now go down the next layer, I can talk about my web server and the security group for it. Now, so I'll go and I'll edit the inbound rules. Now, once again, because this is a web server, I want to have very similar HTTP and HTTPS rules. Now, the first mistake that a lot of people make is they're going to start and they're going to say, well, it's a web server, so I should just make this available from anywhere. It's a very bad practice. You've got the load balancer out there. What we really want to do is enforce that the traffic, the HTTP and HTTPS traffic that's allowed to come to my web server should only be available from the load balancer, not from anywhere. So I'm going to remove these rules. And I look down here into my security groups and select the load balancer. So now traffic can come from anywhere into the load balancer, but only from the load balancer to the web server. I cannot, even if I make that web server publicly accessible, if I put it on the internet, put it in a public subnet, give it a public IP, I still will not be able to direct traffic to it, only from the security group. And I can hit save there. Similarly, if I come down here, go to the database web server, I can edit my inbound rules, and I can come in here and let's see. MS SQL Server, 1433 being the port. What I can do is, once again, I can come down here and say, I only want to accept traffic from my web servers for SQL Server traffic. Now, what I might also want to do here is do an all traffic from the database server. So what this will allow me to do is, if I have two database servers, they can talk to each other with any traffic that they want or need to, do things like keep things in synchronization, and that's fine because only my database servers are going to actually implement this. And my actual SQL Server traffic that I'm going to allow in from the website can only come from my web servers. So right now I've got very layered security in multiple spots that's going to allow traffic to flow in only certain directions. So load balancer to web server to database server, and database server to database server. So an east-west scenario. Now this is going to cover a lot of the rules that you could possibly need for a lot of your different scenarios. You can either have from anywhere, or you can have from another security group. The other option that you can do is, if I look here at my VPC, my demo VPC, I've got a CIDR block here of 1051.00/16. That's a CIDR block for my demo VPC. If I need to, what I can also do is, say my web servers here, maybe I need to allow traffic into that web server from a CIDR block. So I can build a rule that's going to say from anything inside of this VPC, so anything that has that IP address of that matches the 1051.00/16, I can allow that. So I can use a CIDR block there, just a very powerful option. Another option that you can do is something called prefix lists. Prefix lists allow you to create a predefined list of IP addresses and CIDR blocks that you can reuse. So this is very helpful if you have, say, a set of functionality or a set of IP address blocks, maybe for your internal addresses, that you need to be able to reference in your security groups. So you can come here into VPCs, managed prefix lists, and you can create a list of CIDR blocks that you can then use for your rules. So we jump back here once again to our security groups, and let's say demo security group. If I want to edit, oops. Let's say once again on my web server, I could create a new rule that says all traffic, and I can start pulling in these prefix lists. Very powerful, very useful for if you've got ranges of addresses that you're constantly typing over and over and over again. So just to be clear, your rules, when you talk about the source, you can either do source referenced on another security group, on the security group itself. So if you've got a security group implemented by two machines, you can say the same security group rules. You can use a prefix list if you've got a list of CIDR blocks that you're going to be reusing all the time, or you can provide just a manual entered CIDR block there if you've got a range of addresses that you're going to need. And those are the ways that you can build your security groups. Now, my preference, quite frankly, is to use referential security groups wherever possible. It just makes it that much easier because you're dealing with things that are whatever implements that security group. So very useful if you've got, say, an auto-scaling group with a bunch of instances that may spin up and spin down, and they all implement the same security group. So, for example, I may have a web server. I've got a web server that is part of a security group, and then I am spinning up and spinning down instances. Well, I can build my rules tailored to that security group that the web server references, and it doesn't matter how many instances get created. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in this video is how security groups compare to another network security construct called Network Access Control Lists, or NACLs. Okay, so now if we start talking about Network Access Control Lists, or NACLs, in the console we go here, jump to VPC, and you can see down here in security, we had security groups, and the same area is network ACLs. Now, network access control lists are bound to a specific subnet. And they set rules for traffic across the entire subnet, whereas security groups are bound to a specific network interface. If I create a network access control list, once again, we're going to be tying that to a VPC. I can select VPC and I'll demo. And once again, you have tags, so I can create a network access control list. And again, we've got inbound rules and outbound rules, just like we had in security groups. However, these are going to be much more akin to the way you would see rules established in a regular firewall. So what I can do is say edit inbound rules. And you can see we've got a rule number asterisk, so that's going to be the bottom level, the last rule, which has an all traffic, all protocols from all sources deny. Now, right away, here's the change. Access control lists can contain deny rules, whereas security groups only contain allow rules. What I can do is I can say add a new rule. Rule number 1. Once again, I can specify the protocol, so HTTP, for example, my source, and whether I want to allow or deny it. Now, just like with typical firewalls, what's happened is you're going to start at the top and you're going to find a rule that matches and then see if you allow or deny it. Okay. An allow rule will allow the traffic to come through. A deny rule will block that traffic coming through. So if you don't find an allow or a deny, you're going to have an explicit deny that blocks everything else out of that traffic. So access control lists, once again, govern all the traffic coming into the subnet. So they are going to take precedence even before you get to a security group. So if I've got an access control list that denies traffic, that traffic's never going to get to the security group, and so it will never get past that to the instance. So you can use access control lists and security groups in conjunction. So I might want to have, say, access control lists that are very restrictive into my private subnets. That means that nothing can get in there except for very specific traffic that I want to allow. And then be more permissive in subnets that are publicly exposed. So once again, the two, you can use them together. You just do have to be aware of the existence of both because it will affect your troubleshooting. Now, I'm not going to dive too much into access control lists. I just want you to be aware that they are there, and you can use the two to build higher level security. Okay, so we've covered a fair bit of ground in this video about how to get your security groups set up. In summary, there's a default security group that allows all traffic between all instances that implement that security group. It's useful for troubleshooting, but really shouldn't be used long term. Use it and then remove it when it's no longer needed. There are security groups that are created by the launch wizard, but you should really avoid using those as they get very unmanageable very quickly. And there are security groups that you can create separately that can be reused, either through the console or through infrastructure as code. This is the best way to create security groups and reuse them. You can create your rules with either CIDR blocks by referencing other security group rules or by referencing prefix lists. When you create a security group rule based on another security group, you should really read it as allow traffic from anything that implements the listed security group. And when we talk about prefix lists, we're talking about predefined lists of CIDR blocks that helps you to have simpler rules and not have to constantly retype and change those lists of CIDR blocks. Hopefully this has been helpful and it gets you started with creating and maintaining security groups for your applications. If you find my videos helpful, please like and subscribe. It lets me know that you're getting value out of the content I'm creating. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Complete source code for all of my videos can be found on GitHub. You can find me there at github.com/basementprogrammer. Thanks for watching my video. If you found this video helpful, please hit the subscribe button. It helps you to know when I have new content out, and it helps me to know I'm creating useful content for you. You can always find me at basementprogrammer.com, on Twitter, and the Basement Programmer podcast. Details listed here. If you have any comments on this video, or you just want to get in touch, you can always email me. The address is tom@basementprogrammer.com. And I'll see you next time.